Okay, welcome to the remainder of Chapter 2. So before you do the quiz, here's the rest of the information. You can read the slides, but this might be useful as well. So this is the slide in your set that I tried to play the video, but it doesn't seem to work on here. So you might want to try. Michael Pollan is a science journalist. He's written several books, one of which is called The Omnivore's Journey, I think. And this is his advice. So if you start and happen to watch this video, and even if you don't, his advice is you eat food, mostly plants, and not too much. He boiled down nutrition to those 3 points. And his point there is eating food means go around the exterior part of the grocery store, the perimeter and not the interior rows to get real food. Usually that's where you'll find the dairy, the meat, the eggs, and the produce. Those are the foods that we should focus on. We were looking at some of the information about serving sizes the other day in class. So here's that, what counts as a serving. There's some discrepancy about the vegetables and fruits, but as we know, those are the lowest calorie but the highest nutrient density. So remember that there are dairy is equivalent. These are all equivalents in the calcium and some protein there. It's a good source of calcium and protein. You can do these different foods to get that. And then for protein, again, if you don't want to eat 1 ounce of meat or 3 ounces of meat, you could try an egg, a tablespoon of peanut butter, a 1/4 cup of dried cooked beans that's cooked, and a 1/2 ounce of nuts. So those are all the same protein content as 1 ounce of meat. So there's lots of variety there, and they also have iron, zinc, some magnesium, and some B vitamins. So these are all good sources of nutrients. And then the other point here is there's some people will say a cup of leafy and a 1/2 cup of cooked. The 1/4 cup of dried fruit is a serving, and on here it said 1/2 cup of dried fruit. So you're going to see some discrepancies there. As I mentioned in class, that's a lot of dried fruit. So I prefer these fruit and vegetable sizes. The other thing that's on here is a 1/4 cup of cottage cheese is equivalent to a meat serving, and tofu. So there's a couple other things that have good protein source. The cottage cheese is an interesting food because it is high in protein, but it's not that high in calcium. So it takes a whole cup of cottage cheese to be equivalent, and actually even more than that, to be equivalent to dairy food. But just a 1/4 cup of cottage cheese is the same amount of protein as an ounce of meat. So it's quite a good protein source. Some of the government programs or websites, the My Plate website talks about equivalents of vegetables. So this is 1/2 cup of green beans or 1 cup of raw spinach. Those are considered 1 serving of vegetables. If you go for the fruits, a cup of fresh fruit would be a 1 equivalent. So they have a 1/2 cup or about a cup of juice. And again, they say a 1/2 cup of raisins, which I think is a little high. Then for the carbohydrates, you could have a slice of bread or a 1/2 cup of cooked oatmeal, cooked brown rice, cooked pasta. Most of those are equivalent in the carbohydrate content. And then the same for dairy. You can get, this suggests a 3/4 cup equivalent. So really 1 cup of yogurt, 1 cup of milk, 1.5 ounces of cheddar cheese would be equivalent for a dairy. And then for protein, this is a picture of the things we just learned about. The eggs, the peanut butter, the nuts, the dry beans. So just remember that. And if you want to, when you're taking a 3-day recall, if you're not sure what 1/2 cup is or what a cup is, you can think of these objects. So here's a baseball. It's about like 1 cup or 1 large piece of fruit. A deck of cards looks very much like 3 ounces of meat. A golf ball is like 2 tablespoons of peanut butter or salad dressing, and then a tennis ball is about 1/2 cup, which is about the amount of vegetable or pasta that we'd eat in 1 serving. So those are good things to help you remember. And then here is just another recognition that for people with diabetes and people on weight control diets, a lot of times they use what's called exchange lists. You might have heard these, and that's basically taking the food we've just talked about in those food groups that we just talked about, but identifying how much carbohydrate. So if you're a diabetic, you have to be careful how much carbohydrate you eat and how often you eat it. So this is helpful to know that you can get all these variety of starches. If you get them in the right serving size, they all have 15 grams of carb, which is important to someone who's on insulin. Or you can look at the protein. So all the similar sizes of meats have 7 grams of protein. It helps then to do menu planning because you know that as long as you keep the right serving sizes, you have a lot of flexibility in adding starches, adding meats, adding fruits and vegetables. So here's a menu based off that exchange list. So we have the starch, there's the measurements, there's the amount of carbohydrate, there's a little bit of protein in there, and then the calories. So rather than counting calories, this system has you counting an exchange or a serving. Basically, an exchange is a serving that has set amount of carbs or proteins. So that's you might hear of that in your work with different clients, and if you wonder what they're talking about, counting their carbs, counting their protein, whatever, that's probably what they mean. And here's one of the exercises we did in class one time. We took the exchanges to get a total number of calories, about 2,000 calories. So you don't see any calories on here. All you see is the exchanges of milk or dairy, vegetable, fruit, starch, meat, and fat. And we took that and turned it into a menu. So we have broken down, like for breakfast, 1 dairy or 1 milk, 2 starches, 2 fruits, and 1 meat. And then we said, okay, what food? Okay, we're going to drink milk, we'll have some cereal, orange juice, and an egg. And that's your meal. So this is a good way to kind of determine what foods you're going to eat when, to make sure you have a balance of the carbohydrates and fats. Here's the picture of the cottage cheese I was mentioning to you, that it only had a quarter cup of it does have quite a bit of protein, but actually 2 cups of cottage cheese still has a very low calcium content. So it's not usually suggested that it be substituted for dairy, even though you think of it as a dairy. Then the nutrition assessment. So one of the things you might have to do with your clients at some point is determine, how are they nutritionally? How do we determine someone's health nutritionally? So to get their optimal health, we often look at what we call the we look at, talk about that in a minute. We'll talk about nutrition, malnutrition. So this heading of malnutrition could be overnutrition. So you may have a client who has obesity, but it doesn't mean they're nutritionally healthy. Depending what they've eaten and how nutrient dense their diet is, they still could be undernutrition but overnutrition at the same time. But in other words, not proper combination of nutrients to calories. And the same thing with undernutrition, getting too little energy, and usually when you get too little energy, you're also going to get too few nutrients. It's almost unheard of for someone who's getting too few calories to get enough nutrients. Every time I look at a 3-day recall of someone who's getting like 1,500 calories, they're always deficient in other nutrients. So that's one advantage of eating a lot of calories. You tend to hit a better balance of nutrients, but that doesn't mean that someone who's overweight is necessarily healthy. So here is the assessment that we did. I was mentioning the A, B, C, D, E. So that's an easy way to remember that. The A stands for anthropometric. So anthro for man, metrics for measuring. So you're measuring the body, the weight, the length, the thickness of the skin thickness to see how much fat. That's anthropometric set, and that's the BMI, and that you need to determine where someone is in their weight. Biochemical, the B is biochemical, and that's just looking at their blood and urine. How is their iron content? How much blood glucose? What is their lipid content? So you have that information in front of you to help determine the health of a person. You can do the clinical assessment, that's ABC. This is strictly a physical examination. You're looking at someone to say, do they have bags under their eyes? Do they have dry skin? Is their hair falling out? Have they gained a lot of weight recently or lost a lot of weight recently? Do they look like they're pale? Just get a general look at your patient to see what's going on. And then the D is the diet, and that's what you're doing for your 3-day recall. You can do the same thing with your clients, or you can do other types of tests, a 24-hour recall or a food frequency test to see how they're doing. And then the E is environmental living conditions, like do they have education? Do they have transportation? Do they have money to buy food? Do they have access to food? Those are important questions because I just read an article that in the UK, most people that are low income can't even afford a healthy diet. There's too many things that are too expensive for them to be able to consider. So then the last thing here is the nutrient standards. So those are the RDAs that we always hear about. The RDAs were recently incorporated in what they call the dietary reference intakes. That's the overarching heading for all these other topics. So the recommended dietary allowance, the adequate intake, the estimated energy, and the upper intake, the tolerable upper intake. So that's UL, that's abbreviated EER, that's abbreviated AI, and so forth. So these you have to remember and know which one means what. So here's the little schematic. So these terms, the DRIs, the dietary reference intakes. So the RDA will meet 97% of the public. So most people, even up to 98% of the public, will be healthy if they get that amount of each of the nutrients. So the RDA for calcium, as we talked about, is 1,000 milligrams. Now, however, it's a little higher for older people. There's some, some little changes, but at least for the labeling, they use 1,000. The AI is an estimate because I'm not really sure if that exactly how much, like sodium is an example of an AI. We don't know exactly how much our body needs, but we know about how much. The UL, the upper limit, so there's a risk if you go above a certain level. So I think for vitamin C, 2,000 milligrams is considered UL. And then the estimated energy is going to be different for everybody, depending on your age, your height, your weight, your gender, and your physical activity. And you will determine that later in class what yours is and see if you meet it. So those are the important references for nutrition. And then the last section we'll do, and we'll do this in class on Monday, is looking at labels and how can we use labels to pick the right and the best food. So just remember that labels have requirements. The FDA analyzes or sets the requirements. They have to have a title, the weight, the ingredient list, the nutrient information list, and the manufacturer address and name. And one of the things we like to talk about with a nutrition fact label is if you're talking to consumers, it's a lot of information they can't really assess very quickly. So the 520 guide is one of the easiest ways. If you look at the fiber and the vitamins, if you can have 20 or more of a percent of a nutrient, that means it's pretty good. This is a good source of calcium. If it's 5 or less, it's probably not that great. So this isn't really good in any other nutrient, not even in fiber, except for calcium. So it's probably some kind of dairy product. So that's the 520 rule, which really helps. Now, on the other hand, the fats and cholesterol and sodium don't follow that rule. You want them to be limited and low. The lower, the better. So those are just two simple ways to look at this. You have to make sure people know there's a serving size. It's not the whole container, and then the calories are included. And now the new label, it just came out and is still coming out, is here. You can see there's some differences. If you pick them out, I'll help you pick them out, but you can see the size. You can see the size of certain number of servings is larger. They've added the added sugars here, which are not there. They've given actual amounts of micrograms and milligrams, as opposed to here, there's nothing, just percentages. So some people that are counting and know the RDAs might want to see this. And then they have the table that tells you what's considered the baseline for fat, sodium, cholesterol, and so forth. So that's where they're getting percentages from. They're basing off these calorie levels, these gram levels. So we'll be working with labels quite a bit. And the other last thing on labels is you might see health claims, you might see nutrient claims, you might see structure function claims. So we'll look at our labels to see what kind of things are included. So common nutrient claims are calorie-free, low fat, sodium fat, lean meat, and there's certain regulations that have to be followed for those to be included. And the last one is structure function. So you won't see very often that this food will prevent cancer. That's very difficult for a company to assume. They have to prove before they can put these things on the label. So that's the structure function that's not used quite as much. You might see that it helps reduce cholesterol, that kind of thing, but you won't see much in the way of it curing a disease. So that ends these slide set for chapter 2. There's a little bit more, like there's some review questions. So as you go through the slides yourself, there's some review questions you can go through and make sure you know the information. So we'll see you later. Thank you very much.